Your 100-mile best time is 11 hours, 19 minutes, and the current world record was set 2 years ago by Alexander Sorokin,
Yep.
and he did 10:50. So you'd have to drop 28-ish minutes. That seems reasonable if you're in better shape now than then. You're only 38, which ain't that old for
One when he did it. Yeah.
wow, okay, so you're
Yeah,
yeah, so you're nearing your peak, right? And you got the shoes. Why can't you get that world record?
Oh, I'm not saying I can't. I just don't know that it's necessarily a slam dunk by any stretch of the
No, of
imagination.
course not. Sounds
So,
painful too. Sounds not the most fun
I think it's
thing.
on the table. I would say the
All right, we're recording. So Zach Bitter, thanks so much for taking the time to connect today.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me on.
So Zach, you broke the world record in the 100-mile race. You ran 100 miles in, this is ridiculous, 11 hours, 19 minutes and 13 seconds. And that broke the previous record by almost 11 minutes. And when you finished this 100-mile race, you didn't stop. You continued running for another 40 minutes in order to improve your 12-hour distance record to 104.8 miles. And that was an improvement of more than 3 miles over your previous mark. So my question is, what were you thinking when you reached mile 100 and you were exhausted? How did you keep going for almost another 5 miles?
So I knew on that day, based on prior experience, performances and things, if I had a really good day for 100 miles, there was going to be some time left to add to, say, this 12-hour timed event. And I don't go into those with a kind of a dual goal in terms of their weightiness. So my goal there was get 100 miles as fast as you can and do what you can with what's left. So for whatever reason, when I got to 11 hours and 19 minutes and hit that 100 is probably just a degree of just the energy and the adrenaline of the way that race played out, the timeline it took me to get to that point and everything that just kept me motivated to stay out there, albeit a bit slower for that last 41 minutes or so. And yeah, that was good for an extra 4.8 miles on top of it. But I can't say I really went in with a strategy as to what to do there. I've had them before where when I broke the American record for 100 miles a few years prior to that, I stopped at 11 hours and 40 minutes. I just was exhausted. And I guess if there's a physiological reason for that, I would say my pacing strategy for the day I ran 11:19 versus the day I ran 11:40 was much better. I was actually running my fastest miles at the end of that, so I was gaining momentum through the finish line versus when I ran 11:40, I was holding on for dear life. I could not get to 100 miles quick enough that day.
That must have hurt
Yeah.
a lot.
Yeah.
Who do you think's the best runner competing right now? Have you heard of this kid, Jakob Ingebrigtsen? He's shaping up to be the best runner of all time, is what I'm seeing, right?
Yeah.
At least in terms of mid distance.
Mhm.
Well, we'll see if he can scale to marathon, but in terms of mid distance.
Yeah, Jakob's interesting because it would look as if the focus event that he's prioritizing right now isn't even his strength. He's probably better at the 5K and 10K. If you just look at his strengths and weaknesses versus what some of the other top 1,500-meter runners in the world are. But he's still winning the majority of the race. I think I saw a stat the other day where um, he of the last 20 1,500-meter events he's done, he's won 18 of them. So it's you have this relative just dominance of an 18 out of 20 number, but then you also have the two times he got beat were at world championships. So it's of the races you want to make sure you don't lose, those are high on the list as well. But he's very young. He's 23 years old. So he's nowhere near his peak in the 1,500. He's already one or two in the world, depending on who you ask, at an event that he's likely not his best event. So yeah, he's got the world in front of him in terms of what he could do. I think in 10 years we very well may look at Jakob and be okay, that was the best distance runner we ever saw. Again, disciplines matter to some degree because it's not common that you have a person who's as dominant at the 1,500 meter as Jakob could potentially be, becoming the most dominant marathoner. Um, but given that's maybe not his relative strength to begin with, maybe he's more of a 5K 10 guy right now. And technically, even though he's not focusing on those two events the way he is the 1,500, Maybe that gives him a longer stretch in terms of what he could be genetically and trainable wise for something like the marathon in the future. But to a certain point, you get to a point where you have to start categorizing, and then it's, do you look at it through the lens of who had the best success across a range of events versus who was the most dominant at one, so dominant at one event that it overshadows anyone else's dominance in their specific event or their range of events and things that. So you've got all sorts of arguments for guys like Bekele, who's basically been high caliber at everything up to the marathon. Kipchoge's always talked about as one of the most dominant endurance runners of all time and things that it's one of those never ending debates, but so much fun to do.
So Jakob, I feel like he's in his prime right now to do 1500 because of his age and his speed. So if we say he's more of a 5K, 10K, what does that mean? Does that mean that he'd beat the second place guy by even more than he's beating them in the 1500?
Yeah, and I think the reason that people probably say that most of the time is because he's focusing on the 1500
Yeah.
and he got second at the world championships in the 1500 and he won the 5K. So it's like
Yeah.
even by not focusing on it, he won it.
Right.
Whereas, so I think it's all speculation, but I think people are thinking if he's that good at the 5K as a secondary focus, how good would he be if he focused just on that? When if we go by the world championship results,
But that's
he
just one
actually
race.
outperformed.
That's just one race though.
Yeah, but it's the world championships.
Yeah, but it's
It's a
one
big
race.
one.
I'd say he's the leader in both events if you look at his performance throughout the season. And he was obviously much more dominant in the 1500, but that's a result of him having done that race more.
Doing more of them.
But
Yeah.
I think his strategy is really smart, which is that he's in his early approaching mid 20s. If he's going to break world records in the 1500 or mile, it's now or never. If he focuses, what I think he's doing is if he focuses on 5, 10K now and then he wants to revisit the mile in 5 years, his window is closed. I think a lot of the former mile record holders, Usain Bolt as a speed guy was 22 when he broke the records. So you
Mhm.
could make the argument that some people's speed tops out at 22, 23, maybe 25. I think Jakob's how old now? I just think if the guy wants to go for the mile world records, he's got to do it this year or the next
Yeah.
year or the year after that at the very latest, I think.
I don't disagree with his approach. I think his approach is sound given what his potential is. I just think if you wanna get into the speculative world of what is he best at, it would look he's let's say we can fast forward 15 years. Jakob's 38. He's done everything from the 1500 up to the marathon. With all of that, the speculation is maybe we find out that he was the best at the 5K relative to all those
Yeah.
other events.
Right.
But yeah, I think if you can be the best at the 1500 despite it not being your best event, and you're playing the long game in terms of I want to get to the end of my career and say I was the most dominant endurance athlete ever, you do what he's doing. You and to some degree he's already I guess he probably wants to break the world record in the 1500 would be my guess because he has won an Olympic gold. So there is that. So you could make the argument or you could say maybe he's thinking, all right, I break El Garouge's 1500-meter world record, and then maybe wins another gold at the Olympics in Paris this fall or late summer. And then he decides, okay, maybe now I start slowly shifting towards 5K focus, breaks the 5K world record, moves up the chain as far as he can. That seems to be the way he's thinking about things, and it makes sense. It does. Most people just aren't in a position where they even have that option available to them because at this point, the competitive pressure of any of these events would have pushed them towards the one they're best at. Where, if he were most people who are if the 5K is most people's best event, the short nature of these careers and the opportunity potential of doing what they probably want to do at the professional level is going to steer them there before they have a chance to. Jakob's just so good that he has these options to do it in different ways. Most people don't. You wouldn't argue that Josh Kerr would be better off going up to the 5K now because Josh Kerr won't be better at the 5K than he is at the 1500, most likely. I say that now he'll transition to the 5K after this year and just dominate. But,
I'm sure he'll be
but
decent, right? Like if you're a good
yeah.
1500 runner and you get a little older, get some more miles
Mhm.
under you. But you're
Yeah.
saying he
I mean,
might
he
not
ran
be.
a half marathon in
Oh,
100-meter training. So yeah, I think we're talking about the best in the world here. So their relative transferability to any of these distances are going to be world class in most cases. It just depends on where they fall in that top 10 list, more or less. Or in some cases, Jakob, historically, where do you fall in the best times ever list?
Do you think that Jakob Ingebrigtsen has the opportunity to break every world record from 1500 to the marathon?
I would say at least up to the 10K. Beyond the 10K, I would say it gets a little more, but it's certainly not impossible.
Why are you even doubtful? I think he can. He's putting in so many miles at age 23. Other 23-year-olds, who's doing more miles than him that can, but it definitely, I think it gets more competitive as you go up in distance towards the marathon.
Yeah.
Breaking 2 hours,
Yeah,
that's
and
tough.
there's luck involved. He's
Yeah.
gotta stay
Okay.
injury-free through the entirety of his career to really probably thread that needle. You could make the argument that to hold a world record at the 1500, the 5, the 10, the half, and the marathon, even if it's not all at the same time, it's just in combination of when you were focusing on that event. You could say, "Why not?" But then you could say, "Why hasn't it happened then?"
From him, you're
So
saying, or from?
well, from anybody, from anybody. So, like,
Yeah.
just because you just don't you don't have any if you're a betting man, I guess you're saying there's no precedent that has happened before to
Well,
that.
when's the
I mean,
last
there's
time you've had a 22-year-old who was that dominant at 5K?
I'd have to go back and look at what Bekele's times were when he was that young, but he's probably I would say if we're looking for somebody who if you asked me who I think the best endurance athlete ever and we're looking wholesale marathon all the way down to 1500, I'm going with Bekele because I think he's reached a high enough pinnacle at a lot of those events, including cross country and stuff like that, and a lot of the youth records and things as well, where you can make an argument that if you're just looking for a guy who at one point could do it all, he's probably it's hard to argue against him. But Jakob could very well become that. He just needs to put the time in to get there. Bekele's almost 20 years older than him.
Yeah, wow. And
And that's the
Jakob's got
crazy
an
thing about Bekele is he's so old that you wouldn't think he'd be lining up for the Olympic marathon at I think he's 42. But he is. And he recently just put up a world-class time. He's technically got I think the third fastest marathon time in history. So, yeah, it's one of those things where I think if the question is, does Jakob have the potential to do all that? He certainly does. But will everything happen in a manner where year after year things keep going in the right direction to the degree where he is able to take advantage of that and essentially get lucky to some degree? Who knows? That's the biggest if I think in the question.
Here's what Jakob's got on Bekele. Jakob has the 2-mile world record. Bekele will never overtake it. Jakob has a real shot at, I think, I would put money on Jakob breaking the 1500 and the mile record in the next 2 years. Bekele obviously will never be able to overtake that.
You know
And
what I'm going to
then
say, though, right?
what are you gonna say?
Put Bekele in some super shoes and then put him at age
Oh,
25.
well, he was at age 25. He was 25 at some point. He no
But he
longer.
didn't have
So
super
you think
shoes.
so are the shoes that much of a
They're
difference?
good. Yeah. Mhm.
Damn.
Yep. At that level, it's huge. Because we're talking about I agree with you. I think Jakob is going to break the world record in the 1500 in the next couple of years. I wouldn't be surprised if he does it this year. I think I would have said prior to him getting injured at the end of last year, I would have predicted he does it this year. Now that he's got a little bit more of an uphill ramp to get back to where he was last year and then hopefully exceed it, I think it's maybe going to be a little bit harder this year, especially when you're thinking about his main goal here is Paris versus chasing a world record. And Olympics don't typically make that necessarily a I shouldn't say it doesn't take it's on the table because most athletes are putting in that extra bit for an Olympic year. So then maybe someone's in a position where because they're preparing for the Olympics, they have the tools to break a world record outside of the Olympic Games. But typically the tactics of Olympic 1500 wouldn't be conducive for a world record in the event itself, which he's very much going to be his primary focus going forward this year. But he also races a lot. One of his criticisms of some of the guys that have beat him in the past is they cherry pick races. So it's, oh yeah, you pick a couple races, you peak for it, and I'm 10 Diamond League races in, and you nip me at the end. That's where the argument of 18 out of 20 comes in, where it's many guys are doing that much racing either. He's got a little bit of a unique strategy with that. I think it's a strong argument in his defense in terms of just his body of work versus whether he won or didn't win the world championships.
Yeah. Well, I think so. I think that I do think the super shoe thing is a good point. It's a weird thing that you have these two combating things. On one hand, you have Nike and these companies who want to make better and better shoes, and why shouldn't they? That's the whole point of their
Mhm.
company. But if that continues onward, then every record is just going to get beat not by a better person, but by a better technology. I don't know. Or is there
Yeah.
a cap to how good these shoes could be? Because they're not going to put motors in these things. And what do you think? How do you feel
Yeah.
about shoe technology? Is it unfair? Is it going to infinitely improve? Is it going to continuously improve every year?
Yeah, they have gotten strict with it to the degree where when it first came out, it was a scenario of the more foam and the more plates you can get away with before someone just tips over, essentially, the faster, the more efficient you're gonna get. Where they did put some limitations on it where you can't build a shoe above 40 millimeters and more than one plate for road races, and then on the track is 25 millimeters. They have put some limitations on what you can do with that technology. So now there's parameters that you can build within. So even better foam or better plate structures and geometry and things that are the path forward for additional improvement. But the addition, unless they remove those or some completely novel new performance boosting piece of technology comes out. Because we also have Wavelight. We didn't even talk about Wavelight. Wavelight is another thing that is really helpful for breaking world records because you essentially have a digital pace setter that you can key in on. Um, these are all things where you can get angry about it, but to some degree, it's you have a lot of this stuff that gets less attention to where we've got better nutrition, we got better research to tell people how to hydrate. We know now it's probably a bad idea to smoke cigarettes if you're going to be a professional athlete. Like, there's a lot of information that people have available to them now that make them better and faster that aren't necessarily genetically influenced or they're a better runner per se. They just have access to better resources. And to some degree, the shoe is just that. And also to some degree, there is some genetic physiological limit. So what do we do when we get there? What do we do when we get to the point where the fastest human has already showcased themselves? At what point do you lose excitement in the sport because there aren't any more there's no more ability to lower those barriers or raise those barriers depending on how you're looking at it. But so some to some degree, it's the super shoes have also opened up a world where records can be broken again. Where now it can be exciting because it seems every other week we see a world record get broken. That brings a lot of attention, a lot of money, and a lot of excitement into the sport as well. Yeah, there's good arguments on both sides. Sometimes I have to step aside sometimes and think to myself, okay, how much of this am I just thinking about through the lens of it would have been nice if I had super shoes in 2019 when I was running the world record at the time for 100 miles, because how much faster would that have made me? It's yeah,
How
but I
much
mean,
faster would
there's
it make the guys around you too?
exactly, yeah, yeah. So it's really a generational thing for the most part, where if your peak falls within a certain technological generation, you're just gonna have to be okay with that because the people could complain about things that I would have done where I had access to an indoor track with climate control. That's an advantage as well that there was times when people were running races and they didn't have any sort of setup that even track surfaces. Track surfaces are different than they were decades ago, so they're faster. So there's all sorts of things you
Yeah.
can. So at a certain point, you have to like. I think like people tend to be resistant to big changes that kind of shift the results in a drastically way versus one that's so subtle that you hardly notice it happened. And I think the super shoes just exceeded that a little bit in some people's minds anyway, where the relative efficiency was such that now we could notice it was palpable how much of an advantage they gave someone that it felt artificial versus it just being a gradual transition into it over
Yeah.
the course of 10, 20 years.
A couple of things you said that are interesting. I agree that human potential has a limit, right? We're never going to run a 2-minute mile. We're never going to run a 1-minute mile. So that's an obvious statement, but it's not as obvious to say that human potential is limited because you could say, no, people will always get faster. And then you could say, really? Are they ever going to run a 2-minute mile? No.
Right.
Okay. So where's the, so it's an improvement curve, right? Like the
Mhm.
times drop this and then they taper off. And 50 years ago or whatever, records dropping by 10 seconds. Now you
Yeah.
see them dropping by 1 second. In the future, they'll drop by zero point 0.1. So I think records will always get broken, but it's going to be by fractions of a second and
Is
probably
that
will
the
be
measure of
tied to. What?
Measure tighter, yeah. Just have to measure
Yeah,
tighter,
but
add a
also
couple
speak
extra zeros.
yeah, exactly, and through improvements with nutrition and yada yada.
Mhm,
But even with all those improvements, we're never going to run a 2 minute mile, right? So
mhm,
there is a so where is the cutoff? Is it 340? Is it 335? Yeah, speaking of scientific or training improvements, I feel, and I don't know enough about this, but it seems like Jakob and his crew are the first to really popularize lactate threshold training. That's what he credits to his success, I think, is the fact that's what distinguishes him is he is this scientific runner. He's running based off of the reactions that his lactate thresholds are having. And so he's not just going based off his gut, he's making himself a lab rat, is my
mhm.
understanding, right?
Yeah, I would say his method of training, they probably get a little more credit for that approach in general than is really probably this isn't their fault. They're just way more popular. It's people who would have never otherwise paid attention to this are paying attention to them. So they have the signal boost required to put it more on the map or put it back on the map because the Norwegian threshold training isn't something that's necessarily unique to them or new. And that kind of that strategy of threshold being this target intensity has been around for a while. And even lactate measurement has been too, to some degree. But what they're doing, I think, is they're showing a very detailed way to do it versus keeping it in the lab behind closed doors and reserved just for the elite. Anyone can go out and buy a lactate blood measure and mimic what Jakob and his brothers and anyone training with that method are doing and kind of do what they're doing at their own scale to their level and respond appropriately to it. So to some degree, I think they're taking a method and they're putting some data behind it. They're saying, okay, in the past, we just assumed maybe this was a good strategy, or in some people are the best strategy, but we didn't necessarily have as good a data to confirm it. But when guys like Jakob go out and time again, test their lactate and put in the work and then put up the results, we can start getting closer to thinking, okay, where does this actually fall from an evidence-based standard of better or worse than the next strategy? Or what's I look at all these things as opportunity costs. So it's not that other methods aren't gonna yield good results, it's just will they yield better results, and how much of that is gonna be specific to the individual and the event versus being this universal principle of everyone should be doing threshold-based training or everyone should be doing VO2 max-based training or whatever philosophy you choose. I'm sorry, I was rambling. What was the original
Well, he
question? Was
he
it
is so dominant. It sounds like you're not totally bought into his method of training, and yeah, I guess it's not fair for me to point to one person who's successful and say, "Look what they're doing isn't what's working for them. It should
Mhm,
work for everyone." On the other hand, if some guy wore technologically advanced running shoes and he'd cut a few seconds off of his time, you would say, "Wow, those are really advanced shoes," and which you've said, and those are giving him an advantage. I would say the same is true about Jakob's training program. The guy is so dominant. He's I think he's 23 now, right? He's been crushing it, dominating the world. I don't care that he lost by a tenth of a second in the world final. That to me is a red herring. He won every other race. He got the 2 mile world record. It could be a coincidence that he has this training regimen and it's working so well for him, but I don't know. I My suspicion is that there is something advantageous to his lactate threshold training.
mhm.
Do you agree? Do you think you're more skeptical?
Yeah, I mean, I'm skeptical in the sense that I think this becomes a to the individual versus population level recommendation. Meaning, if we applied his methods to the greater endurance community, what result would we get at a population level versus something different than that? And it's not clear to me that his approach is necessarily like the best. To the is one.
Why not? Also, he's not. You're also. I do want to provide the disclaimer that you're an ultra marathoner. So I feel for you, you're trying to sustain, maintain. You're running way below your lactate threshold. You're not trying to bump up against it. Whereas
Right.
that for him is an important knob. So maybe I would imagine it's totally different for an ultra marathoner, 100 miler versus an 800 miler, 2 miler.
Yeah, I'll say this. I'd say so. Threshold work. I'll do threshold sessions quite frequently, probably more than most people would expect for an ultra marathon runner. How the weight of it from a specificity standpoint is going to be different because you said I'm going to be racing at my aerobic threshold, whereas Jakob's racing above his VO2 max. See, that's where I think there's going to be some variance here in sense of how his approach works across the board, because he's putting a lot of emphasis on an intensity that isn't race specific. Now, he's racing a lot. So you can argue that his exposure to race intensity is higher than it looks on paper because he's just doing it live more often than the average person would, versus someone who is going to be a little more strategic in terms of dropping in, say, more VO2 max work or race pace intensity stuff in their training. Um, so I just think if you apply I think the way that what makes endurance training and philosophy and methodology interesting to me is it's not clear that there is an approach that you should just sign off on, versus maybe this is a good starting point for most people, but there are good arguments to pivot from that. And I think we see it. I think Jakob's biggest weakness right now would be his finishing kick. Whereas we see guys like Josh Kerr, if he's in range, Jakob might be in trouble because he's gonna just blow past him.
But that
And
happened
some of that
once. Didn't that happen once?
happened twice. In fact, the second time Josh Kerr, it happened 3 times technically. It wasn't Josh Kerr both times. It was Whiteman the first
All right.
time at the World Champ, and then Whiteman got injured, and Kerr did it the second time. But then Kerr just beat him at the Bowerman Mile. This time the only difference
Yeah.
was Kerr made his move at 600 meters out versus waiting till that home stretch to pass him and then find that Jakob didn't have that last gear. He passed him with 600, just took control of the race,
Yeah.
which you could argue that wasn't a good, that was actually a dangerous move for Kerr.
Mhm.
Uh, I don't think his coach would have advised that move, but it showed his relative fitness and where he's at right now versus where Jakob is. But Jakob is only maybe 8 weeks into his training after being injured. So I think there's going to be some changing happening between now and Paris. But yeah, I think if we went through a fine tooth comb with Josh Kerr's training and Jakob's training, there's going to be differences there. Do we argue then that Josh Kerr should take on Jakob's training and improve, or do we argue that Jakob should take on Josh Kerr's training and improve? I don't necessarily think so. I think it's possible that they have some specific strengths and weaknesses that lead them towards a specific training method that is going to be better for them, but not necessarily everybody.
I don't think it makes a difference for Jake Whiteman and Josh Kerr. I think there's no way. I don't think they're going to beat him again. Jake Whiteman's 29, which it doesn't sound like that old to people, but that's old for the mile. To think that he's going to.
Yeah, I don't think Whiteman will beat him. I think if anyone beats Jakob at the Olympics, it's going to either be Kerr or Yard Naguse. But
Yeah.
I don't think that's going to happen. I think Jakob's gonna win the Olympic gold.
Yeah. Yeah.
But that doesn't change my view of I don't think that had Josh Kerr switched to Jakob's training, now all of a sudden Josh wins the Olympics. I suspect that could potentially push him back further. Or if Jakob took on Josh Kerr's training strategy, I don't think he would necessarily make a bigger improvement upon what he'll end up doing at the Olympics either. I think there's some uniquenesses with their strengths and weaknesses that would maybe lead them to taking on a specific approach versus another that they've likely teased out along their trajectory through the sport as they've figured out what are they more just naturally good at and it's easier for them to maintain versus things that they have to work a little harder at to sharpen and things like that. Because you're going to have a lot less of it, I'll say, at the elite level where strengths and weaknesses tend to get a little more similar because there are certain strengths and weaknesses that kind of send you to the 1500 versus well, the drastic one is the shot put and the 1500. It's their strengths and weaknesses that those individuals have that send them towards that event versus the other one that no amount of training or methodology is going to have them at the same caliber at the world stage. If they had gone the other direction than the other, we'd never see Jakob winning gold in the shot put, and we'd never see the gold medalist at the shot put win the 1500, regardless of what they did at the early stages of training. But that's just the competitive pressure side of things. So there's going to be a lot of similarities compared to what we'd see at a population level. But I still think there is probably some uniqueness that would maybe incentivize people to be more open to there's different coaching philosophies that are going to likely work better for one person versus the other.
If you're not convinced that Jakob Ingebrigtsen's unique training methodology is the reason for his dominance, What is the reason for his dominance?
Probably mostly genetics and then partly consistent work ethic. There's a lot of what I think I don't know that his method isn't a good portion of his dominance. I just don't know that his method would result in a similar amount of or a similar relative improvement across the board. So, like,
Why
if we
not?
put everybody, because what I said before, I think he's probably got certain strengths and weaknesses that would probably incentivize that process. We're assuming that if he had done something completely different, he wouldn't be more dominant. So this is the endless argument of just we can't go back and get Jakob at age 15 and have him do a totally different approach and know what he would be doing otherwise. So we're assuming based on his relative success at the world stage that he's doing the right things versus doing him getting the results despite not doing it. That's
That's
just me.
fair. Yeah, that's fair. But I do think you see someone dominate, it's not logically consistent to say, okay, everything they're doing, that must be perfect. Because you're saying maybe he could be even faster. Yet at the same time, I do think it's worth looking into more what did make Michael Jordan so great. Not that
Yeah.
everything Michael Jordan did caused his success, but I think that everything Michael Jordan did is worth scrutiny or is worth looking into and saying, hey, is this a key to his success or just some unrelated anecdote? I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think this is what makes it exciting, right? It's we don't have definitive answers. And if we had definitive answers, this would get a lot more boring because then it's just plug and play. Then it's just, oh, we've got the approach.
The shoes are definitively
Yeah.
helping you faster.
Well, the shoes are going to give you a relative advantage in most cases. I won't say all cases. There are people who don't respond to them. The biggest variable with the shoes I think that's interesting is when you got some of those original studies that got Nike 4% its label, that was an average from 2 to 8%. So whether you fall on the 2 or the 8 or somewhere in between, that makes a difference too.
2%, 4%. Wait, help me understand that. Sorry.
So it's just a relative efficiency.
Yeah, yeah.
So if you look at maybe an easy way to maybe think about it is let's say I put you on a treadmill and had you run 6-minute mile pace and we looked at your heart rate and then we put you on the treadmill 6-minute mile pace with a super shoe and we look at your heart rate with a super shoe on, that heart rate's going to be lower. So to what degree or to what percentage of efficiency based on those numbers is going to vary from person to person. It's not even one product to rule them all. There's a variety of products out here. Your best product for you may vary from one person to the next, and the degree of efficiency that you get from it does as well. And I'll say this too, there's a lot we don't know too. This stuff is lab studied. So we put some on I had a Rory Linkletter on my podcast, and he just qualified for the Canadian Olympic marathon team. He ran a 2:08. And we were talking about super shoes because he runs for Puma, and they had him in their lab in Boston, and they were just testing their efficiency in their Fast R model, which is their plated kind of premium super shoe, and their Deviate, which is their kind of non-plated but still has the super shoe foam in it. And what they found out was that a lot of the male runners were producing better efficiency in the Fast R with the plate in it. And a lot of the female runners were getting better efficiency results from the Deviate without the plate because the plate requires force to get more and more productive in that. So weight becomes an issue where on average, these male marathoners are maybe 20 pounds heavier than the female ones. So they're just every foot strike putting more force into that plate and yielding a better return. Whereas if that plate isn't getting close to maximized, it could be almost a hindrance relative to just the foam itself. So we saw two Puma athletes qualify for the Olympics on the women's side. Or was it, did I get that right? Is it, there was two Puma athletes on the women's side um, finish high, and they were wearing the Deviate, where you would imagine just based on the spec data that they'd be wearing the Fast R. And then to confuse it even further, we just know their relative efficiency relatively fresh compared to the end of a marathon on a treadmill versus what is changing at how do we don't know what it's doing at mile 23 in a marathon because we don't have access to that data. So it could be some form of reduction of it. It could be an elimination of it. It could be a hindrance to some people. I think we'll learn more about this stuff over the years, but the proof is in the pudding, and that's results. And we've seen those kind of come down quite aggressively from super shoe foams. And carbon plates and whatnot.
Yeah. Final question. If Jakob Ingebrigtsen does get the 1500 world record, the mile world record, and 5K, 10K, will he then be better than Bekele, do you think? If he's got, and that's including the 2 mile world record.
Yeah, I don't know. I probably need to see a list of Bekele's just career in front of me.
Yeah.
I mean,
Not an
he's
easy question.
no, yeah, it's probably gonna come down to just the relative bias of to how much weight you place onto the marathon and the half marathon and cross country and things that, but yeah,
Yeah.
I think the way to maybe here's what I would do. If he does okay, how about this? I would say age adjusted, definitely. Because if we lined up his results up to his age, if he gets those records this year, up to
Oh,
Bekele
not
23 to
this
20.
year. He's not getting 5K, 10K this year.
Oh, okay,
Yeah,
okay,
there's no
okay.
way. No, then that would be,
Okay,
yeah.
and if we're stretching out to 10K with an indefinite timeline,
Yeah.
I would say realistically, he's obviously only doing when he's 50, but and we line that up with Bekele's results through that age. So let's say he gets all of those through. If he gets all those, now that if you're saying 10K, 5K, I'd probably give him the nod at that point because there's just not a lot left on the table. And Bekele's not even the world record holder for the marathon. It would be unreasonable to expect Jakob to then become the marathon world record holder in order to surpass Bekele. And plus, he's holding world records at all those distances too. That's not something Bekele's done. Yeah, I mean, we'd have to weigh in other things too. How much emphasis are we putting on world records versus world championships, Olympic medals, and things that?
You don't think world
And
record
that's
is
where
I've always thought world record is the most important thing. It's
I
who's
mean, it
done the
depends who you
fastest
ask.
thing.
But that's there's a lot of controls on world record attempts that it depends on what you prioritize. Some people think the best the person who on the brightest, biggest stage with some level of non-optimization, some level of non-perfection in terms of how we set up this event, able to still produce the best result on that day. If you really emphasize that as being your signal to who's better or who's the best, this is the Michael Jordan, LeBron James argument, right? Michael Jordan was 6-0 in the NBA finals. So at the brightest lights, at the biggest stage, when it mattered the most, Michael Jordan is undefeated. And it's hard to look past that if you are emphasizing that aspect of competition versus just, oh, who was able to put up the most points over the course of their career or who was able to get the most rebounds. That's the world record argument versus the how did you do at championship level events argument.
Yeah. Yeah. Tough question. We will revisit it later this year, you and I,
Yeah,
once
well,
he
I'll come back on after the Olympics and we'll see if we have
yeah.
any change.
Is there a ultra are you trying to get into the Olympics also, by the way?
There aren't ultra marathons in the
That
Olympics.
sucks.
There are world championships, but actually technically there's an ultra in the Olympics. It's the 50K race walk. So
Um,
that's an ultra, but
lame.
it's a hey, the race walk, you should look at the data for race walkers. It's insane. Their paces, the 50K guys, they're going under 7-minute mile pace walking.
What?
Yeah, for the 10K, they're into the 5-minute mile pace. It's insane.
Huh.
Yeah, I wouldn't
What?
think you could get the
You can
mechanics to
walk
work.
5-minute mile pace?
Yeah, it's insane. Like I had the bronze medalist from the 2021 Olympics or 2020 that happened in 2021 Olympics on my podcast. And I was just asking him these type of questions because I was just curious about like what they're doing to train. And I'll do walking workouts where I'll get my heart rate up to 180. It's
Wait, what? So walking just means one foot is always on the
one
ground.
yeah, so it becomes an art of how do you develop that mechanic to the degree where you can produce that much force to propel you at that pace and produce a heart rate to match the numbers he was suggesting.
I didn't know
Yeah,
people could
it's
walk
actually
that fast. That's so
I
strange. I
know.
feel like if I saw someone walking at a 5-minute mile pace, I'd be weirded out. That sounds
Yeah. Well, it
bizarre.
looks very weird.
Yeah. Huh.
Which I think the biggest hurdle to get over for spectators is just how goofy they look when they're full gas down the finish line where they look relaxed, but they also kind
Why
of look
don't they have a
strained.
run? What's the Anyway, that's a whole separate conversation. I don't totally understand so why don't they have an ultra marathon in the Olympics for you to
I mean,
compete in?
yeah, for the same reason for anything, the politics and the money of it. If it
Yeah.
were such that they were gonna make money by having the 100K or the 24 hour or whatever happened to be in the Olympics, it would be in
Mhm.
the Olympics. And I mean, some of that's just precedent too. It's you get events in where I would imagine elements of ultra marathon running is I could be totally off base on this and just ignorant, but I assume it's exceeded race walking in terms of public notoriety
Oh,
and
yeah.
just so by that argument, it's why isn't something from ultramarathoning in the Olympics if race walking's been in it for a long time, so they've gotten in and they haven't gotten kicked out, so they're there.
Are you gonna do the world championship for ultramarathon?
So there's 2 actually 3 kinda clear options on the roads. There's also trail options as well, but there's a 50K, 100K, and 24-hour. The 100K is actually this December. I don't have a qualifier at the moment, but if I have a really good race in 2 weeks, my 100K split could potentially get me an invite, but whether I do it versus something else, I'll have to make a
Mm.
decision at that point once I either have a yes or no for being on the team.
Why wouldn't you wanna do it? You had the world record pretty recently. It seems like you
But
could
this would be for
easy.
100K.
Yeah, for 100.
Yeah, I probably will if I get the standard and get the invite. Some of it's similar to what we were talking about before, where I love the 100K and I can produce a fast enough time typically to qualify for worlds, but it's not my strongest event. So the opportunity cost of spending the second half of the year preparing specifically for that versus for say a fast 100 mile or say the Javelina 100, which if I do well there, I get in the Western States 100 the following year. I have to weigh those options.
Got it. Got it.
It's basically a luxury of a lot of fun things that I could potentially do, and I have to pick between a bunch of good things, so no one should feel bad.
Do you have any ambitions with the 100-mile race? You gonna try to regain that world title or world record?
Yeah, after my build up for it, I would say I'm in at least good enough shape to go after a faster time than I ran in 2019. So my goal there
Wow.
will be to try to improve upon that. But the world record now is 10 hours and 50 minutes. So I have to take a pretty good chunk off. So I'll have to see. We're talking 6:30 mile pace at that point. I don't think it's off the table by any stretch, especially with shoe tech and things like that. But actually, the funny thing, I talked to one of the guys who's done a lot of the research on super shoes, and I just asked him, "What is if you had to give me a range of what you would guess, and this is speculation, take it with what you will, of how much faster I would go in a control shoe for 100 miles versus a super shoe for 100 miles." So what would you say? And he's probably 10 to 30 minutes. 10 to 30 minutes is a pretty big range,
Wow.
obviously. The fact that it's faster, even on the low end, is at least gets you that much closer. That's all assuming I respond to them in within the typical range, which I probably do. It would stand to reason that I do. And I will be wearing a pair of shoes. It's called the Ultra Vanish Carbon 2. That is a really nice update to their first generation, and I think a lot closer to what we're seeing in some of the higher rated production models of some of the other brand super shoes. So I'm at least closer to that relative technological piece to the puzzle for
Yeah.
this race.
Your 100-mile best time is 11 hours, 19 minutes, and the current world record was set 2 years ago by Alexander Sorokin,
Yep.
and he did 10:50. So you'd have to drop 28-ish minutes, but that's over a long period of time. That seems reasonable if you're in better shape now than then. You're only 38, which ain't that old for.
Fun when he did it. Yeah.
Wow, okay, so
Yeah, yeah.
so you're nearing your peak, right? And you got the shoes. Why can't you get that world record?
Oh, I'm not saying I can't. I just don't know that it's necessarily a slam dunk by any stretch of the
No, of
imagination.
course not. It sounds
So
painful too. Sounds not the most fun
I think it's
thing.
on the table. I would say if I had to look at just a scenario in which it happens, I'd probably have to have almost no non-moving time, meaning no bathroom stops. Or if I do, very minimal and very quick, dozen or 2 seconds or something like that, which I've done some race the fastest I've done or the best I've done in 100 miles or pretty high level from my results standpoint would have been around 60 seconds of non-moving time. When I ran 11:19, I think I had closer to 3 to 4 minutes. So I should be able to clean that up a bit and get a few minutes there. But yeah, I think there's so many goofy little things that you wouldn't. Here's the other thing: on the day of, I'll be on a track with roughly 30-ish other people who are all doing different events. So I'll be the fastest person on the track and I'll be passing them in lanes 2 and 3. So maybe I get really lucky and the field ends up being smaller and people just aren't in the way as much on the turns, and I run a mile less over the course of the actual distance than I would if it's the timing is terrible. I'm out in lane 3 a lot around the turns and I run an extra mile or 2 on top of what I typically would from just the closest measurement on the inside. So there's just some things that are they're not entirely uncontrollable, but there's things you can't really plan for necessarily that when you're talking about taking a 29-minute chunk off of your previous best, you have to be mindful of. It could come down to a few seconds, and all of those things are worth a few seconds.
And you can't get a controlled environment with just you and a laser or something?
You can get a more controlled environment. You just can't get it where you have to have, I think it's 3 competitors at one time. You can't just be solo. Um, so like the ideal scenario would be competitive pressure, would be having Sorokin, myself, and maybe a few other fast guys all go out there and just gun for it. Because then regardless of whether it's me or not, one of us is breaking the world record that day. The other thing you could do is if it wasn't something where you have the competitive pressure, then you just have 3 or 4 people out there. So you're sitting in lane 1 the whole time and you have it in an environment where it's climate controlled, a pettit center, and yeah, you can just stay in lane 1 and yeah, just basically eliminate a lot of those kind of uncontrollables a little bit more, but those are difficult scenarios to come across.
What do you think about during a 100-mile race? I keep trying to let you get off this call. What do you think about during a 100-mile race?
Yeah, that's the hardest question I get because there's so much passive stuff that I don't know whether I'm thinking about it at the time and then I'm just dismissing it to the degree where I don't remember afterwards, or there are certain things that I'm grasping to for one reason or another that I remember that stick in my mind because it's just on a continuous loop or a more continuous loop. But usually it's some kind of series of things that I collect over the training block that I find to be particularly motivating, and it's more about pulling up things that redirect your mind when it tries to go a direction you don't want it to. So, for example, if I'm 40 miles into the race and I start thinking, you know what, I don't feel optimal right now and I got 60 miles to go. How can I expect this to end the way I want it to be? Maybe I should just scale back or give up. That's a seed of doubt that is probably too early to respond to, but I need to dismiss it with something. So then I think of, oh, remember when you had that workout on June 1st where you were 2/3 the way in the long run, you were thinking about cutting it short that day and you just refocused for a couple laps and then all of a sudden you had the best finish to your long run that you had. You just were surprised by that. Why can't that happen today? And it's just weird ways to trick your mind to like steer towards a positive. Things like that. So I call it a series of zooming in and zooming out. There's points where you want to zoom out and consider how much have I done to get here? Would it be really wise to pull out now when really a lot of the work has already been done, both in the race and in the training to get to it? And a series of zooming in where it's at no point at mile 40 should I be overly concerned about mile 95 because I'm nowhere near 95 yet. I need to just be worried about getting to maybe mile 43 and getting that done in a proper man. So it's a lot of just back and forth cognitive load management stuff with positives, focusing on those and trying to dismiss negatives.
Got it. Yeah, it's a lot of time to be thinking and trying to encourage and re-encourage yourself to putting it all
Well,
out there.
and that's
You know,
half of it. That is half of it is are days where you're better at that, where there may be zero physical variance between you on that day versus a different day, or maybe you're even worse physically, but because for one reason or the other, you were able to cognitively manage that side of things better, you run a better time. And it's the thing with ultra running is there's a difference in terms of the pain where I would say you have a lot of kind of more low level discomfort that just doesn't go away. So you have to tolerate it versus say something a 3K, a 5K, or a 10K where there's this more kind of very clear, sharp pain that you can tolerate for a short period of time, but you have to be able to tolerate a higher load of it in that consolidated period of time. So it's if pain is on a spectrum, I guess you could say at ultra running, it's on a lower spectrum, but you have to tolerate for a long period of time. Shorter stuff is higher on the spectrum, but you can consolidate. So it's just the way you mentally process think that is just different. So different things, different experiences, different mindsets can alter that low level discomfort a little bit differently than I think it can some of that sharper stuff that you're going to get at kind of the more Olympic distances.
But doesn't low level become high level once you're 80 miles in? I did an Ironman, and by the end, my legs were on fire.
Yeah.
You jogging even for that long is painful.
Yeah, yeah. I still think it's if you think of it, just imagine in that same environment, you had to speed up. And you just force yourself to speed up for, say, 2 minutes, where they said, "Okay, let's say you're an Ironman, you've got half a marathon left on the run section," and someone said, "Okay, you can be done in 2 minutes, but you have to run 5 miles per hour faster than you're currently going." The pain you're gonna experience in that 2-minute time is gonna greatly exceed the pain you were experiencing going slower, but since you only have to do it for 2 minutes, you can wrap your head around it and get it done versus in order to get that next 13 miles at the current pace, yeah, it's gonna hurt, but it's gonna hurt differently.
And one thing that's unique about you, I was saying this before the call, is that you have not always been a professional or elite runner. You were always a runner, but if I remember correctly, you ran, I think, Division 3 in college, and that's not the same journey that most, I think, world record holders have had. So
Correct,
for
yeah.
you're someone that we can point to and say, okay, you were to be a D3 runner. That's you're in the 1%. And yet it's a different caliber from being a D1 runner. So what was that mindset being a D3 runner to then making the leap to becoming a world record holder?
Yeah, I would say one of the interesting things that kinda stands out to me about that was I had to make a decision at a certain point when I got out of the structures that you get in high school and college to make a conscious decision to be a runner, and be a runner for the sake of running versus be a runner because it was gonna be my sole identity or my profession, and that's probably shaped my just the way I maybe mentally take in anything that I get, where it's take the records, for example. I've held world records, but are the world records really the end all be all for what I'm doing? Would I be doing this despite the world records? And the answer is yes. I'm not sure that's always the case for somebody who, like, was there genetically and then with their buildup and their consistency, their hard work, they get to a level where they're on the trajectory for Olympics at an early enough age where they're hardly old enough to really be making decisions for themselves before they're on that track. That's a different experience entirely. You go from a local to a global type of experience very quickly. Whereas for me, I felt the person who's actually described this to me the best is Steve Magnus. I had him on my podcast a while ago, and he said, there's a lot of value in being able to take it one stage at a time and normalize where you're at before you get to the next level. So for me, I competed in some running events, some track and field meets in middle school, and I was pretty good. I would win some races, I would finish on podiums and things like that. But had I gone to the state and ran with the fastest runners in the state at the time, I would have gotten buried. But I had no clue that even existed at the time. So I was very content and happy with that kind of early development and the goals that came with it. And then high school is the same way, where my expectations overly grand at the beginning, and I had some success early enough within that kind of world where it was okay, there's some clear fun things to motivate me to keep doing this. And one of them was just to make the state meet, or in cross country to make a seat as an individual, but also be part of a team that makes the state meet. And so for me at that point, my world was, can I be a person that's included at this particular event? Where at that time, had I been thinking, what happens if I compete with the nationals, the best in the nation? And, I would have gotten buried there. So then I get to college and I'm running Division 3. I would say I went to a very good Division 3 school. So they were highly ranked in the nation. And I was very mediocre amongst those guys. So at that point, I had gotten to a point in running where I enjoyed it enough to be, I want to learn more about this. I want to learn about what it takes to get better. I want to just immerse myself within this. So I saw that college experience as that opportunity to do that, to be around people who had been more serious about running for longer periods of time, to have access to a nationally ranked coach, to really get a little more detail, more year-round holistic exposure to the sport. And then through that experience, it highlighted to me, this is something I want to keep doing. I want to use get out my physical energies in a way where, running is part of that, despite that not being my primary objective from a career standpoint. And it really wasn't until I got into ultra marathon running where you definitely have some dilution in terms of the competitive pressure that you're going to see at the Olympics or the marathon and things that. But you also have different variables, different strengths, different weaknesses, and things like that. So then ultra marathoning was probably the biggest leap I ever took in terms of, okay, you're a runner who happens to be good, maybe not great, to you're a runner who isn't just good, but you're going to be internationally competitive at certain events that you focus on and things that. And just, I think though, had you told me that in my early days in middle school or high school, okay, your trajectory is to be a professional endurance athlete and you're going to compete at the world stage, I would have that who knows? I don't know, that information would have been healthy for me at the time, whereas taking it in those kind of regional stages or local stages, as I'd say, are the way to go about it, or the way to do it in the most, in my case, probably the most sustainable manner. So now it's when you have things, my record gets broken, that sort of thing. I'm not married to that to the degree where when I broke the record, I was fully aware, oh, I'm going to be a stepping stone here because someone's going to come along very soon and break this record. And then someone's going to see that, get motivated by them, and then break that one. And then in 30, 40 years, you'll have to go down a list of people before you get to my name. And that's just part of what it is. And if my reason for doing this is to maintain or hold that, then I probably am in it for either a short-term period of time, or I need to find other reasons to do it other than that as well.
What was the turning point from you from being that D3 athlete to competing on the world stage? When what was
Yeah,
that journey, or how did you go from solid D3 runner at a great school to competing on the national stage?
yeah, a couple things probably. One was I did a race in 2013 called the Desert Solstice Track Invitational and
And how old
broke.
were you then? Or
That's a good
not to
question. That would have been in 2013, so
guess we're telling everyone
I
your
would have
age.
been
Huh.
27, I think, 27, I believe. Yeah, so I was very young for
Okay.
the sport at the time when you look at just the scope of ultra marathon running. But the sport was really growing at the time too. It had just seen a pretty big upward trend in growth, and that looked it was going to continue potentially exponentially. So I got in at a really good point in time when the cameras were, or the lights, I should say, were slowly shifting towards ultra running as being something that wasn't just this weird thing crazy people do that only maybe 5% of the population knows about too. Yeah, we're still crazy, but people at
Mm.
least are aware of what we're doing and can understand to some
Yeah.
degree the hows and whys and maybe even entertain doing it. So I got invited to this race after I had run what ended up being the fastest 50-mile time in North America that year,
Wow.
and it was just this our track invitational where you have 24 hours to do whatever you want with it. And you can chase all sorts of records, age group, outright records from any distance inside of that 24 hours. So I had thought to myself, you know what? I think based on my 50-mile time and based on the American record had just gotten broken, a guy named John Olson became the first American to break 12 hours in the 100-mile distance. And he was 11:59. I remember thinking, you know what? I had just run 5 hours and 12 minutes for 50 miles. So I'm thinking if I go just over 30 minutes slower for that first 50 miles, I should have enough in the tank to come back in 6 hours and then maybe 6 hours and 10 minutes and have a shot at breaking that record. So I went in with that sort of mindset and ended up basically doing that. I ran 11:47. Literally learned at mile 90 that there was a 12-hour world record and that I was on pace for that. So in
Wow.
terms of having some mental shift in terms of what you think you're capable of to all of a sudden, oh, there's this other thing I can do too here to incentivize a faster close. That was a very clear message to me early on. That's a possibility of how potent just having the right information fed to you at the right time that can change what you think you're capable of. But I went on to break the 12-hour world record that day too. And that was my first sign, okay, maybe there's something here. I wasn't necessarily at that point thinking this is a quit your day job opportunity, go become a professional athlete. I was thinking to myself, here's this niche sport that maybe I can compete in and have a side hustle more or less with it as I continue on with my day job. But I then qualified that next year for the World 100K Championships team where Team USA got gold, and I finished second on the team with a sixth place overall. So that was a pretty big kind of global result. So I started getting some of these results. Like I started carrying momentum where within the sport of ultra marathon running anyway, people were starting to recognize who I was. You start getting opportunities you maybe weren't expecting. I'd have brands reach out to me for sponsorship opportunities and things like that. And then I had friends and acquaintances reach out about whether I coached or not and things like that. So I started seeing the potential there. And by 2015, I had put together enough resources in terms of support from product sponsors and building up kind of a coaching business alongside teaching that I was at a point where if I really wanted to take it seriously, I had to pick between my teaching career or kind of pursuing this. I was going to either be average at both or potentially meet my full potential at one of them. So with youth being an advantageous asset to competitive sport, I figured I better take advantage of this one now if I'm going to, whereas teaching is something I could go back to if it doesn't work out, or if I have a long career and I want to go back to teaching, I can do that. But if I waited 20 years, that the professional athlete side of things wasn't going to be there anymore. I took that plunge, and then really it was been, and to some degree up until probably the last few years, it's just been, let's take this 1 year at a time or a couple of years at a time and just see if momentum keeps growing in a direction where I can make this something that's a reliable career. And yeah, thankfully, so far the sport has continued to grow, and people who are knowledgeable about it, who can offer advice and can produce content and things, what I focused on doing over the years alongside training and racing, have become pieces to a business that's been sustainable for me.
How has that business been? How has it been growing it? H What's the journey been?
Yeah, I would say there's been a lot of trial and error. I don't have a business background, so there's been a lot of learning in terms of what works, what doesn't works, what models are allow me to do what I want to do at a high level without necessarily compromising on things. Am I actually doing this because I love it, or am I doing this because I can monetize it and that sort of thing? So for me, it's always been really focus on the things you enjoy, but pick a few of them and stay consistent with it, and you'll get results that are likely going to be productive in terms of it being a good career move too, in the long term anyway. So for me, I've just long form stuff a lot better than social media short form stuff. So I really focused in on podcasting at an early stage by just engaging with the podcast community, going on a lot of podcasts, eventually getting invited on some of the biggest podcasts in the world, the Joe Rogan Experience, or Lex Friedman's podcast and things that, and just really leaning into the parts of that, the media side of things that I really enjoy. Eventually starting my own podcast and then finding out ways to how does that weave into my coaching business, my career as an athlete and things that. Same with coaching. Coaching has been something where I think the basics have been there all along, but then figuring out a model that I think is going to be the most productive with the people I'm going to work with, and that's going to fit inside my lifestyle and just vibe well with all of that. I've had different approaches, different setups with my coaching business over the years. I would say last year, let's see, I guess we're halfway through this year, but at the beginning, so a year and a half ago, I overhauled things from a structural standpoint with about a 3-year growth plan with the new structure. And it just accelerated to where at the end of, before the end of last year, I was already hitting milestones I was hoping to hit by year 2. So some of that's just the growth of the sport, but I also had the fortunate scenario of having a big enough reach with just the things I had done prior with racing and podcasting and stuff like that, where once I was transparent about what the offerings were and you get some people with experiences with it, I was able to grow it successfully over that time. Social media has always been the one I've always probably liked the least, but that has more or less grown within the other things because there's just so much you can do with social media that kind of works complementary to the things I do really enjoy. So if I record a podcast and want to if I record a podcast and I want to maximize that podcast's reach or that podcast's value to people, it behooves me to clip it up and put out short form content that attracts people to come and listen to the whole thing. Or if I want to educate people on certain aspects of training and reach people who are new to the sport, social media is a really low friction way to get their attention. So thinking of it through okay, what is it that I really like to do to educate people, share what I know, learn with people as we're finding out new things about the sport of ultra marathon running. There's a great arena for that in social media. So sometimes it's just recognizing what it is that you find valuable and that's also valuable to others. And nowadays, attention is sort of currency, for better or worse. Obviously, you can get attention for all the wrong reasons, and that's still currency in a lot of people's minds. Finding ways to garner that as a business model has been, in ways that I find authentic, are the strategy or the business plan in terms of how I go about those different things that I'm doing alongside training and racing.
And you have a lot of content that makes you authentic. You have authenticity in your story. You did break these world records. And how did you train for it? How did you train to, let's say, for the 100-mile record? What was your weekly training?
Yeah, so I have a four-stage approach to building up for a 100-mile race. I'll do everything. There's an off season, which you could say is the beginning or the end of a stage. But there's an off season, then there's a base building phase, then I do a speed work development phase, and then I do an ultra long run development phase. So the off season, the base building phase, and the speed work development phase often don't look all that much different than what you would see people doing for more Olympic distance stuff. They're about getting faster at your low intensity stuff with the base building phase, building up to the amount of volume that is going to be what you can tolerate and target for what you're trying to do. Speed work development phase is going to be, for me, usually a series of short intervals and long intervals that are pinned to your VO2 max of velocity or intensity or lactate threshold. So something that I could do for, say, 12 to 15 minutes for the short intervals, something I could do for maybe 60 minutes on a race day setting for the long intervals. And then the ultra long run development phase is going to be where I pivot from your traditional long run and start getting into, all right, I'm going to do these longer training sessions, sometimes in back to back as the primary focus of my final phase of training, but it's going to be done very specifically towards what I want to do on race day. So for the 100-mile controlled events that I've done, it might be doing a long run on a track for 3 or 4 hours just to get exposure to the stimulus and the pace and intensity that I'll be doing on race day, practice fueling, practicing hydration. So working on the mental and the physiological adaptations that I want to be prepared to for it for 100 miles on that in that environment. So from a volume standpoint, I'm always been a pretty high volume runner since probably the second half of my college years to today as an ultra marathon runner. So my volume is pretty high over the course of my entire training. I probably averaged 100 miles a week over the course of a year when you average out the longest weeks and then the shortest off-season type weeks and things that. So when I get to the top end of peaking for a race, I'm often hitting 120, 130, sometimes 150 plus miles per week with some pretty lengthy sessions on back to back and sometimes 3 days in a row, just really working on the specifics. So my overall philosophy is all of these traditional endurance inputs matter. It's more the order of operations that you want to focus on in terms of these all have their place, but where I position them and the timing of that is likely going to better or worse prepare me for what I'm trying to do on race day. So I follow a process of least specific to most specific. Once I know what's important, I'm going to do the things that are least specific first and the things that are most specific later, closer to the race itself.
Do you running?
Yeah, yeah.
What a dumb
Yeah, I
question,
think
right? Is it something that you intrinsically enjoy when you walk out the door and you go for a run? Is it a chore that you have to do because now it's part of your career and you're chasing records and it's your
yeah,
profession? Or is there a
it's
sense
a
of
great
enjoyment?
question.
Or I'm sure there's a balance. So tell me about that.
Yeah, there's a crossover point where it goes from, oh, I would just do this for the sake of doing it with no other incentives because it feels good. I feel better when I'm doing this versus not doing it. And then there's a portion of the training where it's, I'm doing this because it's going to make me faster on race day. And it's that performance side versus that kind of intuitive, more just therapeutic version of running. And where I find there's other feed in loops because if it's just about peaking for a race, there are times in my career, and it probably ebbs and flows as well, where that alone is enough to motivate me to do that extra bit that I don't necessarily enjoy doing, but I know it's going to make me better. By just thinking by doing this, I could run my fastest time, and that's a good enough incentive. I would say what really drives that though more holistically is I really love just the peaking aspect. So if I have a terrible race, I can still walk away from a training cycle where I went beyond what I would normally do if I had no result-based goals attached to it. Happy and glad I did it because there's so much kind of fun building along the way where you're okay, if I input these set of workouts and I start here, I see that progress, I see those adaptations take place and I see that improvement. And I take value in just the practice of doing that. The question then is, what is it about running that has me exercising that kind of need or that desire through running? Because there's probably dozens, if not hundreds of other things I could do that would meet that same thing. And some of it's probably just running's what I know, running's where I learned that first. Running is what has taught me how to do that in other areas of life. So since my body's holding up so far, I'm gonna just keep doing it.
So, but do you enjoy it? If you go out for a casual run, is that enjoy? What does it feel when you have a run that is enjoyable as opposed to one that it's just hard training?
Yeah, I would say, and there's probably 2 ways to look at it. There's the discomfort and the annoyance of doing a run you don't wanna do when you're doing it, but oftentimes those still present themselves with some accomplishment after. You'll call it type 2 fun in running. There's no way that I'm gonna be enjoying the final 10 miles of here's the way to think about it. When I'm at mile 90 of my best race, if I could just fast forward to 100 and get the result, I'm gonna just fast forward to 100 and get the result. I'm not gonna be, "All right, I wanna experience that in the moment." But after the race, when I reflect back on just, "Oh, yeah, when I got to 90 and asked myself, 'Do I have another gear here?' And my mind wanted to say no, but I overrode it and I pushed a little harder than I thought I could and ran faster in those last 10 miles than I thought I could." The reward there is permanent in terms of just what you can do with that level of, like, confidence and that level of just reassurance that you're able to persevere when the going gets tough. So to some degree, I think it has to get to a point where you ask yourself if it's manageable in order for the reward in the long term to be there, because otherwise you're just telling yourself what you already know. So in from a workout standpoint, it's yeah, I can go out for a run. Let's say I go for a 90-minute run where I'm not peaking, and I'm gonna enjoy every minute of it. I'm gonna enjoy the part where I wake up, I have a cup of coffee, I put on my running shoes, I go out, I get warmed up, I get into the flow of it all, and it's just feels good to move the body. And then you finish, you get a little bit of a runner's high from just the experience, and then you feel better the rest of the day because you went out, you were productive, you moved yourself physically. That's all there. It's really just the point where you get to the hard workout and let's say the last quarter of it is pretty miserable because you're reaching beyond what is enjoyable. But even that has a payoff of what I said before, where you recognize that you were able to do that. And that can heighten your confidence and your ability to feel you can do hard things in other areas of life.
So what's the difference between type 1 and type 2 happiness? Type 2 you're describing as the last 10 miles of a 100-mile race where it sucks during it, but then you
Yeah.
finish and you have the memory of it sucking and of you pushing through it. And you said the reward is permanent, referring to the what? The memory, the feeling that you have of gutting through that final 10 miles and the effect that has on your confidence. Is that basically the type
Yeah.
2 happiness?
Yeah, here's the way to think about it. Type 1 fun with running would be, let's say I meet up with a friend and we go out and we start running and we get to a point 90 minutes in and we're all right, we're having fun, but this is starting to lose its value a little bit. Let's stop at the coffee shop and just sit down and chat there instead. That would be type 1 fun. Whereas if we went out and we're running and we're having fun for the first 90 minutes and then we're like, all right, we don't feel we feel we're about ready to be done, but I really want to test how tough we actually are. And then both of us do a 30 minutes hard at the end of that run when we would have otherwise stopped. And then we signal in our own minds afterwards. Oh, when our brain first sends us that signal of, hey, you've had enough of this. Let's move on to something else. We're bored. You can override that and you can like outperform what your immediate sense said you could. That's the type 2 fun because it's not something you necessarily wanna do in the moment of it, but it's something where once you've done it and you're done with it, it has this value that can be used continuously.
What's the value?
I think just knowing that a lot of the limitations you place on yourself are s self-defined in a lot of cases where learning the way your brain actually works, where you have these conversations with yourself, where your mind wants to focus on the negative because it has no reason for you to push beyond the point of comfort, the point of where everything is manageable and you can process easily. I can push past that and you get somewhere further than I would have otherwise thought. And I think a lot of it is just if when we get too comfortable, we just start placing artificially low limitations on ourselves. And I don't know, maybe this is unique to some people and not others, but I suspect that when people place limitations on themselves and get too comfortable, they oftentimes lose just the value in going about what they're doing because there's not this sense of what if. Everything is certain at that point. And certainty is boring, but it's what already. If I sat down to if I wanted to learn more about a specific topic And I sat down and I got to a point where, oh, I know everything about this topic now. There's really not any real value in me keep learning about it. I've already learned it all versus a scenario where I know I've gotten to a point where I think I found a limit, but there's some reason to believe maybe I could do a little more if I just do this differently. That motivator, I think, is just a powerful tool. And maybe it's just valuable in and of itself. Maybe it doesn't necessarily need to have a greater purpose outside of that other than just keeping you excited about doing things.
How do you feel yourself during before race, during the race? Do you still try to stick to a keto diet ever?
Yeah,
Or
I would say I'm probably most people would say I'm low carb versus keto if we
mm,
want to get really just strict with the definitions. People throw around keto as low carb sometimes, so depending on who you're talking to, they may refer to me as keto. I'll get more kind of strict by the definition keto. We could unpack what that even means because there's not necessarily universal agreement on that, but generally speaking, my carbohydrates are low enough where most people would consider it a ketogenic diet in off-season timeframes or when I'm early in training and my volume is lower, my intensity is really low. And then I start phasing up into kind of more of a low carb category where fat is still far and away the primary macronutrient in my diet. And proteins and carbohydrates are lower, but not to the degree where people would be as think of it as low. And then when you add in just the relative uniqueness of what I do, where when I'm in peak training, I'm easily doubling my resting metabolic rate and sometimes 3xing it on a fairly frequent time frame. So everything gets larger in that. So if you think of it from a percentage standpoint, my carbs still look very low, but if you look at it just a total volume of intake, my carbohydrate intakes can get to that of someone who's sedentary eating a moderate carbohydrate diet, but since I'm eating 2 to 3 times them, it ends up being low from a percentage standpoint. So I tend to look at it from a performance standpoint more as my carbohydrates are low relative to my fat, then my body really doesn't have any choice but to increase my fat oxidation rates, which is really what I'm more interested in is my fat oxidation rates are high enough that on race day, I can get away with a very reasonable fueling strategy in terms of the risk of getting a digestive issue or just even having to manage the logistics of it in general. To me, that's a win because I've simplified it. I find it to be more reliable because I'm not as tied to a very specific exogenous product because the advantage of fat metabolism is you're not gonna run out of it during an event. You're gonna have access to that. It's just a question of whether your body can process it quick enough to meet the demands of what you're doing. And running 100 miles, one of the big differences is it's just lower intensity. So everyone can metabolize higher amounts of fat running 100 miles than they can running a 5K or a 10K or a marathon. But if you pull you can pull other levers too, which I've done with nutrition to increase that even more. So the way to think about it is if you take the average person who's running, when they hit their aerobic threshold, they're going to probably burn about a 50-50 fat to carbohydrate ratio. So half and half. When I hit that point in on the intensity spectrum, I'm closer to 80-90% fat from prior tests. So the fueling arm of that equation is the carbohydrate input. So my carbohydrate input arm is much lower. And when I ran 11:19 for 100 miles, I was taking in around 40 grams of carbohydrate per hour, which was actually probably a little more than I needed based on the fat oxidate test I had. But I also know that 40 grams per hour in a cool environment is not going to be something I have to worry about a digestive issue from. It was one of those things where I can get away with it. It's not going to negatively impact me. Logistically, it was pretty easy on that day because it was a 443-meter track, so you can just basically be handed things that you want. It made sense to use that as the target number for the day.
have you ever run without eating? Or what do you have an opinion on the benefit of fasted runs?
Yeah, I'm just finished up my long run development phase for a race I'll be doing in a couple weeks. And the way I'll usually do that is some of those runs I will actually practice the fueling strategy, the hydration strategy I'm gonna use on race day just to stress test it, remind myself how I feel during it. And then I'll also do some where I do just water and electrolytes. So I take in basically 0 calories. And my goal there is to both say, just remind myself, okay, yeah, I have good enough fat oxidation rates where going out for 30 miles with no fuel or 3 hours, 3.5 hours or something like that with no fuel and just water and electrolytes is something at this intensity that isn't that challenging for my body to be able to do. And it also gives me an opportunity to just compare and contrast how I feel when I'm doing it with no fuel versus when I'm doing it with kind of fuel intake. I've been doing this long enough now. I went to a lower carb approach at the end of 2011, so I'm coming up on 13 years of it. I have enough prior data to know how that varies. So if I'm in a really good spot for a 3 to 4 hour run, the way I feel no fueled versus fueled is very minimal difference, if any at all. But if you extrapolate that out to 10, 11, 12 hours, there will be a difference. So that incentivizes me to practice race day fueling so I'm ready for it on race day. But knowing that in a shorter duration, 3 to 4 hours, it really doesn't make any consequential difference from a quality standpoint of what I'm trying to do with that workout. That's helpful for me in terms of knowing, all right, I have been strict enough with the low carb inputs that it's just not a challenge for me to do it either. I have more, people will call it metabolic flexibility, whether you want to call it that or something else is besides the point at the individual level, in my opinion, because at the individual level, it's can you do it or can you not?
Yeah,
So doing it in the practice, in the field, so to speak, is me showing myself I can or can't.
totally. Yeah. Okay. Zach, yeah, this has been fantastic. I'm going to end the recording and then maybe you and I can wrap up for a couple minutes.
Right on. Well, thanks a
Works.
bunch for having me on.
Yeah. 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 Absolutely. This is great.